Moderating the panel today. I'm joined by my colleague, Darcy Strand. She is the CHRO's Legislative and Administrative Advisor. Darcy is going to be coordinating the tech today for us and monitoring the chat for questions, which we strongly encourage, so please keep them coming. Just type them right in the chat. And if you have any tech issues, you can reach out to Darcy either through the chat or by her email, which she's provided in the chat. And for anyone who's not familiar with Teams, the chat is available. There's a little circular icon with two lines that looks like a text bubble. So hopefully y'all can find that. Please be mindful during the presentation to keep your cameras off if you're not speaking and to mute yourselves so that we can all concentrate on the information that's being provided. And please also, of course, keep in mind that our tech reserves the right to remove any participant from the meeting if their conduct is deemed inappropriate. This workshop is going to be recorded, so please also keep that in mind as well. And lastly, auto captioning is available if anyone needs that. To turn it on, if you're in a Teams application, there are 3 little dots on the upper portion of Teams. If you click on those, you can see a drop-down menu with live captions as an option. And if you are joining as a guest and not in a Teams application, all you have to do is hover your mouse in the middle of the screen and it should pop up. Same 3 dots and choose live captioning. So with that all said, let's meet our panelists today. First up, we have Peter Harrison. Pete is the Senior Policy Fellow with Desegregate Connecticut. Previously, he was a climate and land use researcher with the Boole Center at Columbia University and a Senior National Housing Advisor for Data for Progress. He's been involved with tenant organizing in New York City for over a decade and lives there with his wife, and he's originally from Avon. Next, we have Roger Maldonado. Roger is a staff attorney with Open Communities Alliance, or OCA, as you've probably seen it referred to, where he works on legal, legislative, and policy advocacy to address exclusionary planning and zoning. He's also helping OCA to expand its efforts to be more directly involved in the affordable housing development process in wealthy Connecticut towns with little affordable housing. He's been among the principal authors of several OCA reports addressing topics such as fair housing law and exclusionary planning and zoning practices, including OCA's June 2021 Zoning for Equity report. Prior to joining OCA, Roger worked on fair housing impact litigation under the federal and local law in New York City and Westchester County at the Anti-Discrimination Center. And lastly, joining us today, we have Joseph Williams. Joe is a partner with Shipman and Goodwin and a co-chair of the Real Estate, Environmental, Land Use, and Construction Practice Group. A skilled litigator and trial lawyer, Joe draws on his more than 25 years of wide-ranging dispute resolution experience to help clients proactively identify and prevent issues that can otherwise derail or delay real estate and construction projects. He's known across the state of Connecticut and throughout New England as a fearless, fair-minded, and effective advocate for his clients. And he regularly represents developers, investors, and owners in a wide array of real estate-related proceedings, including affordable housing matters. So on behalf of everyone at the CHRO, I want to give a big thank you to all 3 of our esteemed panelists who are joining us today. And a little bit about me. I'm initially joined the CHRO in 2014 as a durational fair housing attorney and never left. So housing issues are central to my legal experience and my interests. And just this past May, the CHRO published an extensive report titled Connecticut Zoning and Discrimination, which I co-authored with a handful of talented and passionate colleagues. The purpose of our report was to examine the systemic barriers faced by people in Connecticut seeking housing security and how these barriers perpetuate racial segregation both in and beyond housing. The report argues that the evils of racial segregation cannot be eradicated without meaningful reform to residential housing policy and attempts to highlight the qualitatively distinct experiences of people living at the intersection of overlapping systems of privilege and oppression, a concept called intersectionality coined by scholar and civil rights lawyer Kimberly Crenshaw. Our panelists will dive into detail about the data, so I won't. But the main takeaway, we argued, is that exclusionary zoning has a disparate impact on Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, and has caused Connecticut to remain one of the most segregated states in the country, despite its reputation as politically progressive. So with that, I'd like to turn to Pete, who will give us a brief presentation.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the commission for hosting me. I'm delighted to be here and looking forward to the conversation with Joe and Roger today. So yes, I'm in theory getting the slides up here. This is definitely my fault of being uncomfortable with Microsoft Teams, but if I can pull up the share screen, I think Darcy, I think I need to take control of the presentation.
It's on its way. Just give me 1 second here.
Just to get started, I have the awesome responsibility of trying to give a crash course of what zoning laws are, why they're impactful, as Jody mentioned, and I'll give kind of a quick overview of the state of things in Connecticut. And then one of the core aspects for Desegregate CT is sort of putting data behind these arguments. And I'm going to go through very quickly the zoning atlas that we put together last year that really visualizes a lot of these problems and hopefully can frame some of the conversation. So I'll run through that a little bit once we get started.
Sorry, Pete, my computer's of course crashing right on cue here.
No problem. Actually, I'll just give kind of a quick background for folks about Desegregate CT. We are a pro-homes coalition of neighbors and nonprofits from across the state. We're up to about 80 different groups. We really formed out of the upheaval from the George Floyd murder last year and the renewed conversation about racial justice and injustice in this country. And we really think a lot of this, as my colleagues on the panel, are deeply tied to land use policies in this country. So Desegregate CT really said, if we can be laser focused on land use policies, we can start to unpack some of these exclusionary laws that have been very harmful for communities of color. And just as importantly, from our perspective, is to think about the future, which is really in danger of significant climate change. So we really focus on racial justice, economic integration, and climate adaptation with Desegregate CT. So a lot of our work really focuses on that. And that's a lot of my background that Jody mentioned. I come from a research background at the Buell Center at Columbia, where I worked on green reconstruction, which is a framework about thinking about housing and land use and thinking about racial injustice and equities in our legal systems and how to adapt those for the future with climate change. So that's really kind of at the forefront of what we're doing at Desegregate Connecticut, both currently and in the near future.
Sorry, Pete, I'm having trouble with the file you sent. I'm trying to save it as a PDF so I can open it that way. If you can open it on your end, obviously, please feel free. I apologize.
Yeah, I can pull it up if I can share the screen. That's not a problem.
Yes, please go ahead. I'm really sorry.
Yeah, it's if it wasn't your computer, it'd be my computer. So I guess happy that it's. All right, I'll download it here and then I'll get the share up. All right, so I think I'm doing this right. Okay, so I believe my screen is shared.
Yes, I see your screen.
Okay, great.
Okay, so sorry about that. Thank you.
Not at all. This happens all the time. 2 years of this and we're still stuck in this technical glitches. But so yeah, if you can see my screen here, I'll start very quickly through a little bit about us, as I said already. But I do want to, whether folks are coming into this panel with a lot of experience with zoning or zero experience with zoning, I want to give a very quick overview of really what we're talking about when we're talking about land use and zoning. These are rules that are established by towns, planning and zoning commissions, typically made up of volunteers. Some are elected positions, some are appointed. And these bodies and rules determine what types of buildings are allowed in towns, what types of activities are allowed, and where, to what extent, what kind of land they're able to use. And one really important aspect of this, the US Constitution gives all of this power directly to the states that then have given this power to the municipalities. So I think a lot of discussions often come back to local control and the idea that local towns and cities control these rules, which is true, but it is under the premise that the state has that power and grants it to towns and cities, which we think is a really important part of what we're doing in the future here. So why is zoning important? On the positive side of zoning, historically, this has been about protecting public safety through building codes, protecting public health through restricting, coke plants being next to playgrounds and other types of heavy pollution industries. This is about also protecting waterways, forests, and historic sites. Zoning laws are really collected to protect the public health sort of as much as possible. And that's really sort of the genesis of them historically in our legal case, which I'm sure Joe can talk a lot more about. Unfortunately, historically, there have been a lot of misuses of zoning. It makes housing more expensive. And this is largely through things that, even though after 1968 and the Fair Housing Act, racial discrimination was banned in housing, people in towns and industry got around that by putting in these large minimum lot sizes and banning multifamily housing and banning apartment buildings. And we'll talk about that in the zoning atlas section. But effectively, one way to exclude people of color, low-income people broadly, is to have these kind of onerous minimum lot sizes and certain types of housing, single-family housing being the dominant actor. This, in fact, harms public health, because not only are you excluding communities of color from single-family housing in certain towns, but you're tending to concentrate them in proximity to other polluting, environmentally damaging industries, public utilities, and other types of things that are historically show the health disparities between white communities and communities of color. And as we're increasingly understanding, these land use laws are really harming the environment by encouraging suburban sprawl. We have more car-dependent communities. That creates more emissions. It uses more of our natural forests and waterways. So we've seen the connection of the more that we build further out through less density, it's actually really creating a very negative feed loop about our climate impact. Specifically, I'll talk very briefly about the racist history of zoning, and this is really important. It's not something that the demographics of Connecticut being so segregated, as Jody mentioned, it's not an organic outcome. This is very purposely done through explicitly racist zoning laws. Through much of the 20th century, the sort of American dream of single family suburban backyard living was exclusively for white families. Communities of color were sort of redlined in urban areas, which meant they were denied mortgages from banks. Whites were allowed to have those mortgages and move out to the suburbs. A lot of those suburbs, private developments had racial restrictive covenants that didn't allow people to sell homes to communities of color. So this really was a very deep impact of this demographic we have, certainly in Connecticut, but across the country, of a massive disparity of who lives where. Suburbs are sort of, in the popular conscious, understood to be white spaces. Cities are understood to be BIPOC spaces because of this very active racist zoning history. In Connecticut, that's very much illustrated. I'll get into the zoning atlas very quickly, but 91% of Connecticut residential zoned land, that meaning land that's specifically for people living on, it's zoned for single family lots that requires at least 1 acre. So what that means in practice, of course, is that most of Connecticut is sort of low density, car dependent, large houses on large lots kind of spread apart. And that's true certainly from other places in the country, but Connecticut is kind of uniquely segregated along those land use policies. And I'll show that in the atlas in a second. I'm going to jump to why that's very impactful. I'm sure Joe and Roger can talk about this as well, but 2/3 of Connecticut's Black and Latino residents live in just 15 of the state's 169 towns. That is a massive, massive discrepancy of racial segregation. And again, it ties deeply back to these zoning laws. So we see why Connecticut is like this because it's zoned for single family residential areas. It concentrates as communities of color in a very small pocket of communities. And that has detrimental impacts for communities of color that are stuck near polluting industries, power plants, et cetera. They don't have access to health and education, food deserts. These are having very much multi-generational impacts on communities. This is illustrated by home ownership rates in Connecticut specifically. 76% of white families own homes in Connecticut. Contrast that with 39 and 34 for Black and Latinx communities, respectively. This is a bigger gap in Connecticut than there is across the country. What this means in practice is there's a massive discrepancy in wealth. Of course, home ownership is probably the main vehicle for most American families. Exclusive policy for many years in America, there's a huge discrepancy. So in Connecticut, the median Black family has 10% of the wealth of the white family, and Hispanic families have 12%. So it's all deeply tied to land use policies, which is why Desegregate CT, OPA, and Joe's practice is really trying to unpack a lot of these laws and create more opportunities for folks to bring these discrepancies down. I am going to switch over now to go through what this looks like visually a little bit, and then we'll jump in here. Did everybody see that transition? Can they see this big purple map of Connecticut? Somebody give me a heads up here.
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, great. So as I mentioned earlier, Desegregate CT, we are very much a data-driven organization. A lot of our value, aside from sort of political organizing, has been about putting data and numbers and visualizing this data behind these things to make it easy for folks to recognize the discrepancies. So just very quickly, I want to highlight 3 things about our atlas, and I'll put a link in the chat so folks can explore this and your town specifically. This, of course, is the map of overview of Connecticut. As I mentioned, 91% of the state is residential land is zoned for single family housing. So this is what this looks like, broadly speaking. And anything that's not in purple is either natural reserves, industrial, commercial, mixed use, et cetera. So everything that's purple is residential single family zoning. And I want to go through here quickly. One of the focuses for Desegregate CT is this issue of minimum lot sizes that really restricts a lot of building in towns, particularly exclusionary suburbs. So this right now, the purple that's highlighted has a range of homes that are allowed as of right for 1/10 of an acre all the way up. So I'm just going to, for visual sake, remove some of these things. And this is now just the residential land that requires basically at least an acre, in some cases more. So you can see a lot of the state, particularly the rural and suburban areas, requires at least a acre per lot for residential housing, in some cases 2. Now, in some cases for the rural areas, that 2-acre requirement is more of a product of technology around septic tanks and water tanks and requiring a certain separation historically, which is probably not as needed right now. So there's some recognizing the sort of different purposes of these laws. But what we can see here again is that most of the towns in Connecticut require an immense amount of land to build just a single housing. Something else that I want to highlight quickly here is 4-family housing. This is multifamily housing, whether it's townhouses, apartments, or whatever. As of right, very few towns allow this kind of housing in Connecticut. You can just see a scattering of purple here. So in some cases too, you can do this through permitting. This also has a similar problem of even if towns allow a certain amount of minimal lot size or allow multifamily, the lot requirements are so extensive that it doesn't make it economically possible. And then one of the things that we are focused on in the coming year and certainly beyond the future is not just this issue of changing land use policy, but tying it very deeply to the access to public transportation. As I mentioned, we're very focused on the climate impacts of this land use regime, and we think it's not just enough to allow multi-family housing across the state, which is really important, but it's also about allowing the housing where we need people to live around transit stations. So I'm just going to highlight very quickly. We mapped out the 40 or so towns that have transit-oriented or transit stations, whether it's a train station, Metro North, Shoreline, Hartford Line, or a rapid bus up in the Hartford area. And one of our focus is, unfortunately, basically 1 in 4 of the towns in Connecticut that have transit lines do not allow multifamily housing around their stations, which is just a giant missed opportunity, and really feeds into, again, this discrepancy of folks that are trapped in areas that are further from jobs, further from services, further from fruit areas. So I'm picking on Westport here for, there's not the only one to pick on, but I just want to zoom in here quickly and show what this looks like in practice. So here we have Westport. There's 2 stations on the Metro North line. There's the Westport Main Line and then Green Farms. And Westport has a couple of different requirements for 1-family housing. And if you can zoom in here, the dots that we have around the transit station represents a half mile. So in a half mile of the Green Farms station, the as of right housing is only single family housing, and it has to be on least an acre. And I actually think in Westport it's 2 acres. So yeah, so this is a pretty egregious example, certainly not the only one in Connecticut, but this station only allows single family housing on basically a minimum of 2 acres. So that's, of course, a massive missed opportunity and really drives this narrative that towns that have these kinds of public resources really need to do more to create more housing around that. So that's going to be one of our focuses going into the legislature this coming year. But this resource I'll put up on the chat here so folks can explore it more and learn a little bit more on our website. We put out a couple of economic reports on transit-oriented communities and their benefits and from the climate impact. So we have a lot of this resources on our website that I'll link to afterwards. But yeah, I want to stop talking and turn it over to Roger and Joe here.
Thank
you, Pete. And Roger, you're up.
But took the words out of my mouth. I was going to say thank you, Pete. Hopefully we'll be able to do the screen share a little quicker here, but I share Pete's gratitude to Darcy if it also ends up being not my computer that that ends up having a glitch. It always seems to happen. Before we jump in, I just want to say hi. I'm Roger Maldonado. As noted, I'm a staff attorney with Open Communities Alliance. It's really a pleasure to be here speaking with all of you and with such esteemed members on the panel. The early part of my presentation, Pete really just did a great job of hitting a bunch of what I wanted to talk about in terms of sort of the really explicitly, unfortunately, racist history behind land use policy and private practice in Connecticut and throughout the country. So once the slides are up, I think I'll be able to speed through my early part a little bit more. So
wonderful. It's loading, so that's a good sign.
Great. And just by way of preview for what I'm planning to talk about, I'll again go through quickly a little bit of the history and the current context, since Pete did a really nice job of hitting a lot of the same issues that, as he noted, all of us here today are directly concerned with and trying to redress, before talking about some of the work that OCA has done through its zoning for equity analysis as to specific, challenges. And I see a circle, which is a good sign.
There we go.
Great. So there we are. So again, thank you. My name is Roger Maldonado. I'm going to take control so I can start moving through. How does it stay? Is there a way to have the slide be the whole screen again? Or, I mean, it's not a big problem, I guess, but that's fine.
I'll mess with it.
It's all right. So I'll just keep on going.
Okay.
So Pete mentioned redlining, which is obviously a huge contributor to the generational wealth gap that we still live with and to segregation. And you'll see in the bottom of this slide just that it really was explicit, explicitly racial in the way that it was designed. Racial covenants was another issue that Pete touched upon. And until 1948, when they were deemed unconstitutional, although they were private agreements between sellers and buyers, lessors and lessees, they were enforced by every level of government. And again, this is something where the language really is explicit. What's perhaps less known is that zoning itself, the core case, and why we call it Euclidean zoning in so much of the country, is this Euclid v. Amber case from the Supreme Court in 1926, which allowed municipalities to block multifamily from certain areas of town. So what's less known about that case is that the underlying decision that was affirmed that was addressed is one that explicitly was predicated upon racist sentiments underlying this zoning practice. So zoning itself is directly implicated in this terrible history. And it's terrible history that we live with today. It's no surprise to anyone that Connecticut has a massive affordability crisis, nor that it's a racialized affordability crisis. And zoning, which says where, or more importantly for today's panel purposes, where you can't build multifamily and affordable housing, is directly related to that crisis and makes it so that families of color and low-income people can't access our high opportunity communities. Lo and behold, Connecticut is one of the absolute most segregated states in the country. And for another sort of data perspective, after my presentation, I'll drop these links, but OCA has an opportunity mapping tool that we're very proud of and actually has been used recently with regards to LIHTC in our state. You'll see here, this is the Hartford area we've zoomed in on, but you can look anywhere in the state or the state as a whole. The lighter orange areas are low and very low opportunity areas based on a multitude of metrics. And unfortunately, you can just see where the dots are, which are African American and Latino households. They are concentrated in low and very low opportunity areas and extremely sparse in other parts of the Hartford region. This crisis is not isolated. It's one throughout our state. Pete's stats talk to that. Here's another way to look at it. 75% of white households live outside of our lowest opportunity areas, whereas almost the exact proportion of Black households live in those same areas. And Latino, Hispanic households have almost very similar numbers. So it's an obvious crisis. And part of what's so concerning about this crisis is this is something where we've had laws on the books that are quite strong, that should have helped rectify this crisis already. So the recently organized 8-2 has long provided that zoning shall, a strong word, provide for multifamily development and take into account the needs of the entire region, not just the local municipality, as well as provide for economic diversity in housing. Public Act 2129, which Desegregate had obviously a lot to do with, reinforced these pre-existing obligations with language about zoning having to affirmatively further the purposes of the Federal Fair Housing Act. That act was adopted in the wake of the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And its central purpose, as articulated by the Supreme Court recently, is explicit. It's about eradicating discriminatory practices, and zoning is at the core of the practices which are targeted by the act. And we've seen that not just in the Supreme Court level, but here in Connecticut, the Builders Service case, which the other panelist here today, Joe Williams' firm, I believe, had a lot to do with, where there was an explicit focus on the ability of zoning to be a discriminatory tool and how that's unacceptable. And in the Second Circuit, following the Supreme Court decision I alluded to, there's a decision which, again, struck down a zoning ordinance or regulation as being both intentionally and having the impact of being discriminatory and perpetuating segregation. So with that, I'll shift to zoning for equity, which was an effort by OCA to really take a thorough look at the planning and zoning practices of 12 towns in our state that was meant to be illustrative. And these towns were illustrative for a lot of reasons you would not want to be. They are unfortunately deeply segregated racially, both in absolute and in relative terms, as you can see with Southington here. They are economically segregated, and there is a dire lack of affordable housing in these towns, particularly if you were to winnow down in the data and look at opportunities for low-income families, because in some of these towns there's, where there's affordable housing developed, it tends to be senior affordable housing. The goals of the report were to, again, pick towns that could illustrate a lot of the issues, underscore some of the limitations of the solutions that have been deployed, or supposed solutions that have been deployed to date to produce multifamily and affordable housing. This is a critical one I'm going to get to again in a second, but show how the importance of a holistic focus on this problem, both in terms of understanding the interplay of planning and zoning, but also within, not just isolating on specific policies, but understanding that they all work together, unfortunately, right now in the wrong direction, and empowering advocates in towns to make changes. So I just mentioned that other piece about the holistic focus, and what basically the thrust of zoning for equity is. We've identified these problems or certain problems, but we really want towns to dig in and invert the formula to make it so that rather than everything working together to keep multifamily and affordable housing out and the families and people of color that they would benefit, to be doing the opposite, to be embracing a more inclusive Connecticut. So I'm just going to run through really quickly some of the individual core lessons. So as I've already alluded to, planning is a big part of this. It's not just zoning. If you set yourself on the path, you're going to get to where you're aiming is basically the lesson there. And Berlin is a good example because you can see how little land there is for multifamily housing, and the planning, it makes clear that they intended to keep it that way. In terms of the second lesson is really about bureaucratic impediments where, not a surprise, multifamily housing is subjected to far more review, often, especially, almost always, especially in these towns, a special exception procedure, public hearings. And Southbury we flagged because it really kind of shows in numbers how this effect this can play. Two-family housing in Southbury actually outperforms the state, but which is as of right in many residential zones, but every other type of multifamily, which is not as of right, underperforms, often significantly. And the other critical point as to this with procedure, it seems to not, oh, there we go. Now I went too far. Let's see if it goes back. I had a little delay, sorry. Very good, is that it's not a surprise that having these added procedures results in less things getting passed. Towns know that there's a lot of opposition that comes out. It's maybe the most no-duh sort of finding of zoning for equity is that in these high opportunity towns, there's just not a ton of land. That is, in fact, there's very little available for multifamily and affordable housing development. In Madison, you can barely see the orange land all south of the highway where there's those opportunities made available, and planning reinforces that by discouraging it outside of those areas. I apologize, the slides keep on delaying on me when I try to shift to the next one. Okay, great. Something that was just touched upon, huge lot and parcel sizes is a problem throughout Connecticut. I don't need to go too much into that because we just talked about it. But I will say that it's an issue which transcends single family housing. You sometimes see extremely differential treatment of single family versus multifamily housing, as is the case again in Berlin, with just massive increases within the same zone. Density, I think this comes as no surprise, is something that is a huge challenge. You simply can't build multifamily housing if you can only build a certain number of units per acre, which is the standard measure, but there are others. Another common refrain that we saw was, multifamily housing has to happen on water and sewer, even though modern well and septic technology allow for multifamily housing off water and sewer. And obviously everything would be is governed by the public health code. Ridgefield is just a great example because it's almost a one-to-one correlation of their infrastructure and where they are looking to build multifamily housing. a lot of the housing that we do see that's made available theoretically through zoning is targeted away from families, which and that's also a planning issue, as the language in Fairfield suggests, a focus on, young working couples, the elderly, people without kids, basically. And then the last sort of lesson was that there were a bunch of provisions that take up a lot of the focus of towns, but we unfortunately think do not have the robust potential to, on their own, to move forward integration. I think that's where I want to pause and say it's not that these strategies on their own they can't be part of the overall strategy, but towns, they take up an inordinate amount of the bandwidth. They can reinforce the single family status quo, and you really do need that more holistic approach that takes advantage of other more robust strategies. One last sort of example were our residency preferences, which, while we had it in only one town in our study, do exist elsewhere in Connecticut and are obviously problematic. If you take a segregated town, set aside housing for the people who already live there, you're going to have a problem. So I should have had a timer. I may have already been pushing time, but I'll just try to run through the end here. I apologize. Thank you for bearing with me. So in terms of next steps, this is a great example of one of the things that OCA thinks is so critical, community engagement and outreach. The report that Jody alluded to by CHRO was another great example of that. Many of you are familiar with OCA's work trying to actually change zoning in towns, which is something we're expanding upon. And then at the state level, OCA has really been championing a fair share model. So we spent years developing this model. I shouldn't be so generous to myself. I'm relatively new to OCA, but OCA has spent years really thinking about this, doing tons of research, outreach to stakeholders across the spectrum, working with experts in New Jersey, where there's been a successful fair share system in place for decades. That resulted in a bill last year that did not go the distance, but was a great starting point. And we are refining now and building on our pre-existing coalition. So just really quickly, sort of the core principles behind fair share are: you take a look at the affordable housing need throughout the state, and then you allocate that on a regional basis. And this is where the fair is really a key term, because one of the core principles of fair share is that every town has its part to play, taking into account its existing, what it already provides in terms of housing, its grand list, things like that. And this also works along with 8-2, which has the focus on councils of government. So that's the regions that fair share looks at. And it puts into place planning and enforcement mechanisms, as well as some benchmarks and guidelines for, ensuring that not all the housing is built in one area of town, or that it's not all senior. But otherwise, it really does invite towns to use all the tools at their disposal to get things to happen. I just wanted to flag, we were so thrilled to see in the zoning and discrimination report that Jody alluded to, that a fair share scheme was one of the recommendations, among other great ideas, in that report. And then I wanted to hammer home that, it really is a holistic approach. And we mean it when I say it puts towns in the driver's seat. So you'll see here some of the strategies that have already been discussed today. And the point is, any one of these strategies on its own is not going to go the distance. But Connecticut has so much ground to make up. We are so segregated. For so long, all of our zoning has been working in the opposite direction, that this sort of a comprehensive approach, while entrusting towns to figure out which are the tools that they can really make use of to get to these ambitious marks, is the best way forward to really ensure we rectify our unfortunate history. And I'll close by pointing out that it's not just we feel the right thing to do and the best way to get to where we want to go, but it's one that comes with a ton of benefits. The numbers on the left in Jersey actually understate how much has been generated in that state, because the past few years have been a tremendous time for fair share in New Jersey. And on the right, we can see huge economic gains potentially could come to the state of Connecticut. And these numbers actually were from a few years ago, so it might actually be even more robust. So with that, I'm sorry if I went a little over time, but thank you so much, and really looking forward to hearing to Joe and talking with you all.
Thank you, Roger. No apologies needed. Next, we're going to hear from Joe about the practical implications of all of these concepts. Thank you.
Thank you, Jody, and thank you, Pete and Roger. Those are tough acts to follow. So I just want to first express my appreciation to all three of you and to CHRO, Desegregate CT, and Open Communities Alliance for all the great work that you all have been doing. You know, the research, the shining a light, the advocacy is all extremely important. And I can say makes my job easier because you give me a lot of material that I watch carefully, I read carefully, and I use in applications all the time, you know, in the trenches before local land use commissions. I just also want to note before I start that I'm giving you my personal opinions and reflections on some things here. They're not the opinions of my law firm or any clients, but mine alone. Having said that, I would start by concurring just briefly because it's been covered, but I concur with the point that Pete and Roger have gone over today, that zoning really, and I'm glad that people are focused on it much more so recently, that zoning has played a role in racially segregating Connecticut. It's not the only player, but it's an important one due to the predominantly single-family zoning, which you saw, and the prohibition of multifamily housing, which together with other things have limited opportunities for communities of color to move into suburbs and rural towns. That's been in place since the 1920s and the Euclid case that Roger talked about. And our neighborhoods and towns in Connecticut grew up under that regime, and you know, the properties and generational wealth were passed down largely within white families, and persons of color were largely steered toward more urban areas. So 100 years in a nutshell, I concur with what they have shown and said about that. My second point is that our zoning permitting system allows that segregated landscape to stay that way still today. That began not only after the Euclid case, but really was put into place systemically with the home rule system in Connecticut that was adopted by our state legislature as sort of as a reaction to the corruption in county government that was reviled, and the legislature sought to make a change, but essentially put each individual town in charge of being able to adopt its own charter, being able to adopt its own zoning regulations, and run land use decision making in its town, and including public education as well. And that, as was said very aptly, that's not just something that was sort of preordained or came down from the heavens, but that was a specific delegation of authority by the Connecticut General Assembly to our towns. The main statute that was referenced is Section 8-2, the Zoning Enabling Act. And under that system, our towns still today have a tremendous amount of discretion in deciding what uses to allow in the town and where. And they're really, unlike some other states, there really isn't any state or regional oversight on that decision-making process, at least at an administrative executive government level. The oversight that we do have is that you can appeal decisions of local land use commissions to the Superior Court. It's an administrative appeal where the record that was developed before the agency goes before a judge who looks at it and sits as sort of an appellate judge and decides whether the commission violated the legal rules that apply to its decision. But in any kind of land use decision, when it goes up on appeal, the judge grants a great deal of deference to the factual findings, to the decisions made by the commission, whether to believe certain witnesses, because it's sitting in an appellate capacity. And especially when it comes to the bigger picture decisions like amending the regulations or amending the zoning designation of a certain piece of property, those the courts consider to be legislative level decisions that, as I said, are given great deference, and as long as there's a reasonable basis for the decision, will be upheld by the courts. And so that overall system still in place today inhibits change and integration to a large degree. We've seen that in the atlas from Desegregate that was shared. I can tell you that I have seen and heard more than my fair share of many unfortunate things being said by people revealing certain assumptions on their part over the years. That certainly does not mean that every land use decision or every person involved in making land use decisions around our state are motivated by race or some other prohibited consideration. That's certainly not the case. And people are driven by lots of motivations. But one of those other motivations that inhibits change in land use is the way our school systems are funded, which is by the property tax at each individual town level, which causes, understandably, public officials to worry quite a bit about what are the fiscal impacts or the hit to the town budget of a certain development proposal. And when it comes to any kind of multifamily or proposal, residential housing proposal that has density, there's always great concern about how are you impacting our school system, because that comes directly from, it's paid for by the property taxes paid by the people who live in that town. And even though our state Supreme Court and courts at all levels in Connecticut have said that fiscal zoning, meaning a zoning decision based upon what will be the financial impact of the town, how will it impact property taxes in the town, is illegal, it's still a concern, and it comes up every day on applications all around Connecticut. And that's, sorry, I've seen that innumerable times over 27 years or so. But whatever the reasons are, I would say the proof is in the pudding. You've seen the data and the mapping, which is very helpful, showing that we do live in one of the most segregated states in America, and we do have a severe shortage of affordable housing and multifamily housing alternatives. Part of that is I have seen that for innocuous reasons or otherwise, in Connecticut, there really is a fear of density in housing, and the system and the rules that we have in place reflect that fear, I believe, my opinion, and they help to protect it. First, it's, as I said, very difficult to change land uses in a town. It's a legislative level decision and given a lot of discretion. But also, if multifamily housing is allowed in a town, it's often allowed by special permit. And if you don't deal with zoning, what that means is some types of land uses are allowed so-called as of right, meaning like a subdivision for single family houses is a classic example. You don't have a public hearing on an application for the subdivision usually. And as long as you show that you comply with the objective black and white criteria of the regulations, like how wide the roads must be and how far a building must be from a property line, you're essentially assured approval as long as you comply with those requirements. But where you need a special permit, that's a higher level of land use permitting, where the zoning commission, in designating that use as one that requires special permit, has said the use is permitted in town, but it is one that could have greater impacts on the community and the neighborhoods, and therefore requires a higher level of scrutiny. And in that situation, the commissions will apply what I have always called more squishy criteria for decision making that has long included: does your proposal impact the character of the neighborhood? Will you harm property values? Are you generally going to impact traffic density and safety in the town? Those sorts of things make it much more difficult to get that type of use approved. And again, the commission is granted deference by the courts in making decisions as to whether those criteria have been satisfied. It was also mentioned that minimum lot sizes, minimum dwelling unit sizes make it difficult for multifamily and affordable housing to be financially workable, as does excessive parking requirements. Some towns have very high fees that you have to pay to access the sewer system or to connect to it, and that can make a project financially unworkable as well for any kind of density. So, having said all of that, my third point is that there have been a multitude of efforts and progress that's been made over the years to make zoning more inclusive and to allow our state to be integrated. One of those efforts was mentioned by Roger, a landmark case, Builder Service Corporation versus the East Hampton Planning and Zoning Commission, which my colleague and mentor, Tim Hollister, argued. I believe that was a 1988 decision of our state Supreme Court. I mentioned floor area, but in that case, the town of East Hampton required minimum floor areas that were fairly substantial, 1,300, 1,400 square foot dwelling units. And the amount of square footage required varied depending on which zone you were in. And the state Supreme Court, in looking at it, said you didn't tie this floor area requirement at all to occupancy. It's not rationally based on or tied to any public health and safety reason. And as the quote showed that Roger put up there, shows that there could have been intent to discriminate if there wasn't any legitimate or rational basis for the regulation, which was struck down in that decision. Another substantial effort that was made by the state legislature in the late 80s was the adoption of the Affordable Housing Land Use Appeals Statute, Section 8-30G. And the reason that was an important change, and it was really the first major change in the power and the discretion given to zoning commissions that was done by the legislature since the adoption of zoning, is because for certain types of affordable housing application, it flips the burden of proof onto the Planning and Zoning Commission if an appeal is brought to Superior Court. So as I said a moment ago, usually if you appeal a decision of a Planning and Zoning Commission, the commission is often able to rely on fairly broad factors and will be given a fairly light level of review by the court in deciding whether that decision was valid. And recognizing that that type of decision making was leading to a serious dearth of affordable housing in our state, the legislature said that if you propose affordable housing and you are denied and you bring an appeal, the Planning and Zoning Commission then effectively becomes the plaintiff, and the commission has to prove to the court that its decision to deny the application was necessary to protect a substantial public interest in health or safety, and that substantial public interest clearly outweighed the need for affordable housing in that town, and that interest could not be protected by reasonable changes to the application. It's a very powerful, and that came from some examples of other states in New Jersey and Massachusetts. It is a very powerful tool. Developers most of the time win those appeals when they bring them, but one of the few limitations in that option that's available is that towns historically have fought those kinds of applications vigorously and heavily scrutinized the applications and made it very expensive and time consuming and difficult to bring that sort of application and to win that type of appeal. Even though in an 830G appeal, the zoning regulations themselves are not a valid reason for denial, even if you don't comply with them. Towns have focused on the availability of sewer capacity or fire safety access or impacts to wildlife habitat, all kinds of different things that you then have to hire multiple consultants and experts at significant expense to deal with. Since 830G's adoption, there has been a virtually annual effort by various members of the legislature to repeal it or to substantially weaken it. Over time, the legislature increased the percentage of affordable units that are required in a development to qualify for that burden shifting. And that's had, I think, the unfortunate effect that it's made it financially more difficult, especially as property values increase, for developers to make that kind of application work financially. And in the last few years, I think we've been seeing less of those types of applications. It has certainly made a difference. It has led to the creation of thousands of units of affordable housing across our state. But as I said, its usage has declined some, and it's nowhere near made a big enough dent in our need for affordable housing in the state. But the last point I'll close on is, as I think Pete mentioned, I really do view there to be a change in the landscape after the murder of George Floyd last year. I'm cautiously and somewhat optimistic about some of the reactions I've seen among commissions, some of whom planning and zoning commissions have voted to sign on to the Desegregate CT campaign and its legislative and other advocacy efforts. Some commissions that have modified affordable housing regulations that they had in place but were so difficult that nobody built anything under it to make it easier and to approve specific development projects. I've seen commissions recently require affordable housing just to be a small component of an overall market rate multifamily housing proposal, even though it wasn't under 830G. And I was very pleased to see the Public Act that was sponsored and promoted by Desegregate that was adopted by the legislature a few months ago, Public Act 21-29, which provides for accessory dwelling units. It limits the amount of parking that commissions can require. It limits floor areas, it limits application fees, and it gets rid of the ability of a town to use character of the neighborhood as a reason to deny an application. It does more than that, but those are the big things to me, having seen all of these things come up on applications and be used as bases for a decision, that I was very glad to see progress on. I really was cheering for part of the bill that would require multifamily housing to be permitted within a certain distance from transit stations, which to me, again, my own opinion, makes perfect sense, and would be a great planning tool. And I hope that will come back up again. And there, the political compromise being what it is, the bill had to allow for some towns to opt out of the accessory dwelling unit and parking provisions, I believe it is. I haven't seen many doing that though, so I'm hopeful that they won't, and that provision will stay in the legislation as well. I've probably gone on long enough. I did provide, and I'm sorry I didn't look to see if they were in there. I did provide some links that, Darcy, if you want to put those up in the chat, please do. They were to a recent article that I wrote about what's going on in multifamily housing around the state, and to the builder service case, and to 8-30G, the statute I talked about.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Joe.
Great, thanks.
Thank you, Joe. Yeah, those links are in the chat, as well as links from OCA and the CHRO's report, and links from Desegregate. So we've got a lot of great resources in the chat for folks to take a look at. And we already have hand raised, so that's great. I have a bunch of questions, of course, some more general and some more specific. We know this is a pretty dense topic, and there might be a broad array of levels of familiarity with these concepts. So I was gonna just start with one more general question, because I know even Darcy and I have discussed that sometimes the heavy data and the specifics can get a little confusing. And so I wanna try to have a balance of more general and specific questions. And my first question, before we get to hands, is really just a broad question to all of you. What do you think is unique about Connecticut that it's such a progressive state politically? I mean, we've been the first in the country to pass certain civil rights protections, or first or second. Often we seem to often be second, but we're pretty progressive, and yet we are the most segregated state in the country. And the phrase "not in my backyard," the NIMBY, seems pretty strong here, despite the progressive politics. And so I'm just curious to hear what each of your perspectives is on what makes Connecticut such this unique combination of those two things.
I guess I could jump in first very quickly, Jody. I guess I would actually push back and say we're not that unique in this context. And I think we have unique geography and history, just like every place else, but this is a problem virtually in every state. I think we really are in the forefront in Connecticut, California, Massachusetts, Minnesota, Oregon a little bit. So we're tackling it first, but it's a deep, deep problem, and it's just not easy to digest in sort of an ideological lens and sort of a partisan lens that I think so much of our political conversation is. Oftentimes folks that do resist these changes are, or would consider themselves, liberals or progressives. We see this a lot, where somebody might have a Black Lives Matter sign on their front lawn, but would oppose having an ADU or a multifamily apartment on their street. And that speaks to kind of the deeper structural problems. And Joe, you did a great job of talking about this, and Roger mentioned this as well. Just the incentives are very much aligned against this kind of forward thinking. They're at the individual homeowner level. Of course, your home value is your nest egg, and there's a misperception of multifamily housing would damage that. That goes back to the historical redlining and other things. So there's a misconception at that level, even though the opposite is true, and we've got plenty of data for that, but the political message is hard there. So there's an incentive for homeowners to not want that much change. Some of it's just the human nature of not wanting change, but it's a lot of it's incentive. And Joe, you mentioned this too, at the town level, the incentive against expanding infrastructure because of education budgets, services. Towns don't necessarily have the incentive right now to really encourage this kind of development. So there is the kind of personal perception, and there is some animus, and there's just some natural instincts here. So that's true across the country, but I think Connecticut, we have the advantage of being a small state, having actually a large concentration of fairly dense cities and proximity to suburbs that I think we're better positioned in some states to address some of these structural incentives, but it's really, really hard to do that. And even I think Build Back Better framework was just announced on our call here, trying to shake some of this status quo loose, but it's a big challenge, and we've got to tackle it in a number of different strategies.
Yeah, I'll jump on second, and I want to echo Pete's point in that, Connecticut is certainly not the only place in the country or the region that faces these issues. On a personal note, I grew up as one of, I think I can count on two hands, the number of Latino students that graduated from my high school in a suburb of New York City, Westchester County, where I did a lot of work before coming here back to work again in Connecticut, is a place with many of the same issues that we see here. But that actually also highlights one of the things that is a unique challenge in Connecticut. We lack county level governments here in Connecticut. We are 169 individual towns that has been said, I think by all three speakers, can sort of, unfortunately, take a fiefdom sort of approach and keep people out or wall people out. And that's a unique challenge that, really takes some critical thinking to figure out how we work around that. I think two other sort of things that make maybe our unique challenges in Connecticut are, although there are many other parts of the country that lack water and sewer, it's kind of amazing to me in even towns like right on Metro North, how much of town will not have access to water and sewer. And as we've seen, how much of that is used as an excuse for not developing any degree of even, lower scale multifamily housing. And I think the last thing I'd flag is actually one of the ways that Connecticut, as you mentioned, Jody, we're ahead in some ways. And as Joe rightfully highlighted, 830G was this great achievement that came out of the builder's service case, but its availability in a way actually has perhaps disincentivized use of tools such as the Federal Fair Housing Act, because it is, such a robust tool. So it's a good thing, but it's also something which has made it so that other tools that maybe are, because of out of necessity, are utilized in other parts of the country, are not given as robust play here in Connecticut.
I agree, and it's all of that. I guess I would add my own armchair psychologist impression as somebody who did not grow up here. I'm a Philadelphia native. So just, observing Connecticut and New England for the 27 years that I've lived here is, they're not kidding about the land of steady habits. I mean, all humans, I think, fear change, but change is an especially scary thing. I think here in Connecticut, as I said, there is a fear of density, and that comes from a lot of different things. I do believe, my own personal opinion, Connecticut has a fairly complicated history with race, and that's not gone yet. So I do believe there's that, and then there's all the other financial and different incentives we talked about. This is Connecticut. There is some, I believe, in my own personal observations, there is some classism and elitism that may have nothing to do with race or other things, but just where people like where they are the way it is. And yeah, they may advocate for something at another level, but they don't want that happening in their neighborhood because they like it the way it is. And it's understandable they like it the way it is. But so there's that as well, and just sort of like fear of things getting different or people you don't know coming into your neighborhood. I think there's just a lot of that still.
Yeah. Thank you. I want to call on Tammy Exum. You have your hand up. You can just unmute yourself and ask your question. If you'd like to put your camera on, you can as well. Up to you. Is Tammy with us? Okay, we can come back to Tammy unless, you know, if your mic's off. Give me a second. Okay. We can certainly circle back to Tammy. Won't lose her spot. I will ask you all, what do you think one or two of the top mechanisms would be to make the biggest impact in the next couple of years? What's something that you think is one of the biggest priorities of a mechanism that could create more affordable housing opportunities in predominantly white communities in the short term?
I don't know if we're doing the same order here. I guess I'll go then. I think the important framing for this question is also deeply tied to climate change and the reality that our perception of land use and the regime of land use has to change very dramatically in the next 20 or 30 years, and where we build homes is going to be impacted by where that's safe and sustainable to do. So even starting from the question of how do we build housing in exclusionary white suburbs or more rural parts of the state, that's important, but we really have to think about it of where should we build and where we should not build. And that complicates, I think, strategies for all of us. But in terms of specifics, the number one thing, I think what we've tried to focus on in Desegregate CT is just popularize this issue and tie this back. There was this window in 2020, as we've mentioned, because of the George Floyd murder, where more folks were interested in these kinds of issues. So it's important to have way more outreach, understanding the connection of these issues, and just educating the population, residents, homeowners, home renters, commissioners, whatever that is. So that's the important thing. But in terms of building up the political appetite in Connecticut for some of these changes, that's very incremental, as we all know, land of steady habits, as Joe said. But what we think is really important is creating a foundation for, at this point, maybe seemingly incremental changes that lay the foundation for this kind of popular change, which is what we did with Public Act 2129. But going forward immediately, with the idea of climate change in mind, we're really focused on minimum lot sizes and changing that regime, just making it more economically viable for more multifamily housing, very focused on transit-oriented communities, which is this concept of building more housing and more commerce around our transit stations in Connecticut. So, these are really, really critical things to get done that we also think are popular or achievable in this priority, but it's part of this larger reorientation of the narrative of, what is the American dream? It just cannot be sprawl in suburbs and car ownership. It's got to be walkable communities, mixture of nature and development. And that's really what the long-term priorities are.
Roger, if it's okay, I'll jump in just so we go in a different order one time. That's all well said. And we continue to need some, what I would call nudging from the state in tweaking of 8-2 or other applicable statutes like desegregate led recently. For that to obviously those are political decisions. So for that to happen, attitudes and education needs to continue to evolve and progress. So all of you keep doing what you're doing, put the information out there. I think as more and the demand and the market interest in multifamily housing right now is very robust. It's probably the biggest share of my practice right now than I've had in at least 10 years. I talked about that in that article. So the more things that get approved, the more that towns see this little community here doesn't destroy my town like people said it would. And then they also see that those apartment complexes become their biggest taxpayer in their town. There's more and more experience, leads to more and more acceptance, like is true with anything. So that needs to happen. So we need more volume of units getting approved so that people can see the good result, and it will also bring down prices as the supply increases under basic supply and demand economics. So we do need people continuing to go to the legislature and try to make it easier to get multifamily housing approved. And it's important to try to keep focusing on specific issues rather than a broad hammer sounding like mandate to a town that you must allow this, because that's what's extremely difficult, I think, to get through the legislature. And of course, there are times when government subsidy doesn't hurt either. That can make an affordable development doable where it may not have been.
Great. So, I think it's no surprise OCA is very out front about that. We feel that it's not so much one individual mechanism. It's really bringing a full suite of tools to the table that all work to open up access to historically exclusionary communities. And that's part of what we think is one of the strengths of Fair Share. It doesn't identify this is the one way that we're going to get it done. It sets ambitious benchmarks for towns to make up the gap that we are so far behind. But it says all of these tools really do need to be brought to bear. And it centers, I think, these, and this is something that touches on what both Pete and Joe were saying. It centers, the civil rights narrative and the real sense of equity in how we move forward as a state. Every town needs to be doing its fair share to overcome our legacy of segregation. I will say that in terms of a specific mechanism that's not zoning, but that is critical, is something which I know CHRO's report also mentioned, and something that obviously OCA has worked on in the past and is currently involved in litigation regarding, which is opening up, making it so that vouchers can be used not just within, currently hyper segregated municipal context where there's an overconcentration of voucher holders, but, can be used more robustly throughout the state. And, I don't need to go too much into the weeds on that, but that's a critical policy tool. And I guess the last thing I'll say that ties in with that is what's also important, and I think everybody here agrees, is that it's not just one avenue we need to be going down. We need to be pursuing legislative solutions at the state level. We need to be educating people at the local level. We need to be, getting advocates out there and getting towns to, revisit and really think about what they're doing. There also are, tools that we can be using outside of that sort of context, be it litigation or other things, to help get move the ball forward.
Thank you.
If I could jump in here, we actually have some great comments in the chat that relate to what the panelists are talking about, particularly in terms of legislation that may be needed or other state action that we may need to take at this point. Florence Johnson made a great comment about asking why state agencies or housing advocacy organizations haven't developed or disseminated model zoning legislation like they have in Massachusetts to help municipalities update their zoning codes. She asked something similar about municipal health and sanitation departments, why there aren't model regulations available to them to modernize their septic on land served by wells. Some of the issues that the panelists talked about in terms of the septic systems or sewer systems being used sort of as a reason not to make some of these zoning changes that advocacy groups have been arguing for. So you've all talked about it a little bit, but could you talk a little more specifically about some of the work that state agencies or advocacy groups could be doing to put out model legislation model town ordinances or zoning regulations that towns could be using to kind of move these changes forward?
I was just reading that comment by Florence as well, and I thought, yeah, that's a very good point, Florence. Why haven't we done it? I would say probably politics and the home rule mentality, but my question would be, why don't we? We do have, the preservation and protection of inland wetlands is delegated by the state legislature to the state DEP and to towns. And the DEP really oversees what the towns do and adopted a model set of regulations. They did the same thing for the Aquifer Protection Program, model set of regulations that the towns essentially have to adopt or give basically a really good reason why they're not adopting the model regulations handed to them by the state. It's also true for noise ordinances that are regulated by DEEP, certain levels within proximity to residential uses, that sort of. So we do have those examples, and I'm sure there are many other examples. Zoning is different in the sense that every neighborhood is different, every town and every use is different. However, even though we don't have to have it as more of a mandate like we did for environmental protection programs, where the issues are more sort of uniform, you could have model things that the town has the option to adopt, but they can see a good way to do it and make it easy for them. And maybe there's some incentive that comes with it in some way. I think it's a terrific idea.
I'll jump in, I guess. I don't know if this is the same sort of all panel question, and now we're really mixing up the order. So I echo a lot of what Joe just said. I will note as I think in particular the point of why have we not seen this? Well, what we would want out of a model ordinance is something that would be very unlikely to be said from down on high that all towns must be doing XYZ. I will say to boost CHRO on its own behalf that there were some really good ideas about these exact sort of things in the report that was released back in May about addressing bans on multifamily housing throughout towns, among any number of other suggestions. And that, so we do see that, and it'd be great to see more of those sort of explicit messages coming from the state. And one other thing I guess I'll say about the model ordinances is, in Westchester County, there was a landmark lawsuit that was settled in 2009 for that included a lot of provisions for both the development of affordable housing and how it should be done in 31 municipalities there. And that included a model ordinance provision, basically. And the cautionary note from there is that a model ordinance which is not good can be harmful. Because, it's been a while since I've taken a look at that. So, and this is just Roger Maldonado speaking, not OCA speaking. But, my recollection was that it could have been a lot stronger than it was. And then if you have a model ordinance which doesn't get the job done and is held forward as being a bulwark for these towns, that could actually end up being counterproductive. So we would just, if we were to go this route as a state, I think it would require a lot of input from all the stakeholders, like the people we have here today, like CHRO, to make sure that we did it right.
Yeah, and I'll just add, I think Sarah actually posted this as well, but Florence, it's a great question. It's something that we're working on a lot. We're actually very proud. We got sort of the foundation of a model form-based code passed in our Public Act 2129, which we think we can really build more capacity around. That's kind of what we're working on in the future. So it's a necessary part. Again, I think we're all in agreement that dictating from on high, whether it's through the courts or the state, is hard. So there's a lot of local structure that needs to be built up in capacity that we're all working on. But I do think the idea of us laying the foundation for this sort of form-based code is really important one. Roger, you're right. I mean, if it's a bad form code, then even if it's streamlining housing construction, but it's not the right kind of housing, the right kind of places, then it can be detrimental. But we think there are some towns, and I think actually Sarah might have mentioned this a couple places. Yeah, so a couple towns that we're working with that are really working on this appropriately, and I think can serve as the model for doing this at the state level. So Florence, don't worry, there's movement about this, but yeah, it takes a lot, and it's some legislative policy education for folks that are electeds and commissioners that do want to do the right thing and do the best thing, and understanding what those best practices look like, what those requirements look like holistically. And then it is also about the political buy-in at the local level and at the state level. So we're working.
Okay. So one question that I had was if anyone was able to explain, just in case there's anyone in the audience today that's not familiar with the concept of gentrification. And then my question is, how do we expand opportunities throughout the state, but while still avoiding the common pitfall of gentrification?
I'll jump in a bit, but I'm sure with his background, Pete would love, and well, both panelists, but I'm sure Pete from his background specifically can speak to this. You know, gentrification in general refers to, and often it's sort of used to mean the same thing as displacement. They're used coterminously, although they are distinct concepts. In historically underinvested areas, generally communities of color, there is a influx of wealth, of people, higher income households coming in, which then pushes pressures, rent pressures, home prices on home value pressures, and forces people who've been there out. They can no longer afford to stay. So that's the displacement gentrification piece. I'm sure Pete has a more articulate way of defining that. In terms of how we can do it, this is actually part of why we think it's so critically important that we open up access to opportunity in the suburbs. The whole OCA platform is about maximizing choice. There are going to be people who want to remain in the communities where they've, built networks, they've spent decades, their families are there, totally, of course. And those communities deserve to be fully revitalized, or, have more investment come their way. And that was another thing that I know CHRO flagged in its report. But at the same time, if we were to just pour every single dollar we possibly could into doing that without opening up opportunity in these other areas, you'd see, you'd run into a lot of the same market problems of demand would massively increase, but there wouldn't be places for people to go. So we really do need to have a two-way road, which it's not just a Connecticut problem, as we've talked about before. Throughout the region, throughout the country, we see this issue of part of why it's so hard to find affordable housing for families, even in cities where there's more of it, is because those are the only places, those are the only markets they can go to. So it's by opening up access to the suburbs while also investing in the cities, we can hopefully mitigate some of those effects.
Yeah, Roger, that was great. I agree with the broad overview of the problem. I mean, stepping back for a second, we have an affordability crisis in Connecticut, in the country, but it really is a product of multiple housing crises. It's not a single crisis. And in some communities, it's a lack of housing stock, whether it's rentals or homeownership. But in other places, there are pressures from an influx of folks raising rents and displacing existing communities. And both of those are true in Connecticut in different levels. So it's really hard to sort of articulate this for folks, because when everyone thinks of housing crisis, there are places where rents are very low and there's underinvested communities, but people are still getting displaced because capital is kind of returning to certain communities. So I think, the challenge for Connecticut is what Roger said, is very much an across the board supply issue of building housing in dense, walkable, transit connected communities has to be, I think, the priority. Because again, we can't keep the model of land use development that we had in the 20th century. It's just incredibly damaging to communities of color, to our health, to the environment. So we have to really, really rethink where we're building housing and where we're concentrating. I think there is a demographic interest from millennials, Gen Z, Zoomers, whatever it is, of returning to walkable communities. Empty nesters in a lot of cases want that as well, particularly in Connecticut. So there are, I think, already kind of natural preferences for folks to have a concentration, which of course, some towns have that better than others in Connecticut. And just one thing from my research at the Buell Center, I mentioned earlier about this concept of green reconstruction. It is a challenge of very desirable places, which great transit, walkable resources. The future of work is this kind of hybrid model where folks aren't necessarily commuting to cities. It's a really big challenge to do this right and without triggering larger displacement. So there's aspects of gentrification that are, certain metrics are actually good things. There's more investment, there's more activity, there's more small businesses coming in, that's great. But the downside, of course, is a separate issue, is displacement. So we have to think of a framework in Connecticut that gets development and gets resources into places that we want to see developed, particularly around transit, but that are also not displacing existing communities or encouraging, a multiracial, multi-economic level development. And that takes a lot of work, again, from all kinds of angles. I think that's the theme of this panel. It takes everybody here and very different strategies to achieve it.
I would like to adopt both of those responses in full, and I cannot improve upon them.
Well, we have about 5 minutes left. I did want to highlight a comment from the chat from, let me see, Dina Artist, I believe. She says Southington overwhelmingly voted to have the town acquire the developmental rights to a golf course whose owners were planning to sell to a housing developer who people were afraid was going to build affordable housing. So the residents voted for it to be acquired by the town, who will presumably be keeping it as an open space instead.
I was so glad to see that comment, because we came across this when we were writing zoning for equity, this exact issue. So thank you, Dina, for flagging that. And I think it sort of speaks to like part of the core, one of the biggest challenges in Connecticut, which is, we have laws on the place, obviously not just about housing, but about concerns around the environment and about open space. And those can be used in responsible, honest, good ways, of course. Like, it's not like we don't want to have any parks or we don't want to have, good, clean water. Those are great resources, of course. But unfortunately, these ideas of open space and infrastructure can be weaponized in ways that are clearly used to keep out housing. And it's perhaps particularly egregious in the context of a golf course, which is a little different than, maybe a nice mountainside stroll or something. But it's a problem that we've seen in a lot of places, and it's one we really need to figure out how to properly balance priorities.
Yeah, absolutely. I also wanted to thank you, Roger, for also mentioning the issue of choice, because I do think, I know I've probably said to you in other meetings, I think that's very important. And I was going to ask folks, what's your answer to Black and Brown, Black and Latinx folks who don't want to move, who don't think that they should have to have proximity to other white people or move to predominantly white towns in order to have the same safety and resources and investment as those predominantly white towns, because we know historically that was taken. So, of course, it's a multi-pronged approach to a very large problem. So thank you for highlighting that. I think we only have just another moment left, so I'll ask you one last quick question. I have a lot of them. Let me pick one. How do we, let's see. I guess here's a last one. How can OCA and Desegregate Connecticut collaborate in a way that kind of builds on everyone's strengths and pulls all of the different shareholders and advocacy groups and state agencies and everyone that's working towards the same goal? How do you think we can continue to build on that and use each group's strengths to achieve this?
Maybe Joe would be best suited to answer that.
No, you guys go ahead. All I can say is that I will support your efforts.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we've all talked about is that this is a really, really huge, deeply ingrained issue in this state, and there has to be different approaches to it, and tackling it from the legal side, from the municipal side, from the state side, and increasingly from the federal side as well down the road. So, it's a positive sum game of having resources put together on separate tracks and on collaborative tracks. So I think, our strengths are focusing on local organizing and political will and legislative action. And we need support in that work from organizations like OCA and others. and there's an element for needing to change the popular narrative in this state above all else. We can't really come in on high, whether from state legislation or from court mandates, to really get a lot of this stuff done. We've got to change some hearts and minds. And I think luckily, as OCA has done, as the commission has done, the data's on our side. Like, these are great arguments and positive outcomes for people doing this kind of work. So we have that on our side, which is really great. It's not a hard sell to do these things, but it is a sell. And right now we've got to work on that. So I think going forward, with whatever our priorities are, we're all going in the same direction, and it is to win hearts and minds and get all these really good arguments out there. And I think there's a lot of reasons to be optimistic about what's happening in Connecticut. Even if we're a little bit late to the game on this, we've got a lot of momentum to do these things.
Yeah, and just really quick, I mean, I agree that, the core, I think, point that Pete made there, and I agree with, is that we all see the problem, and it's a problem of empirics too. I mean, this is not something you can turn a blind eye to. So, I mean, I think going forward, what, I hear Pete saying, and I agree with, and what OCA certainly wants is, that focus on what is actually going to integrate our state, what needs to be done, and really centering the issue, this civil rights issue of racial injustice that has unfortunately plagued Connecticut for so long, having that be front and center as we work towards the solution.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would
Go
just add, keep educating, researching, and advocating, and what OCA is doing recently to actually make an application and put an issue front and center. That kind of work is hugely important. But as I said earlier, people seeing more stuff getting built and occupied and working successfully and working financially successfully for their town is hugely important as well. So thank you for the opportunity to speak to these issues with this fabulous panel.
Thank you, all three of you, for amazing presentations, your time this morning, answering all of these questions. It's been a fantastic presentation. And I just want to remind everyone before you go that there is a very exciting talk during lunch by Dr. Brown Dean. The link that you hopefully were using earlier this morning for the introduction is the link for the lunch presentation. It starts at 12. Dr. Brown Dean on journalism in the civil rights era. It's going to be fantastic. So please join us. And there's 2 more workshops this afternoon, 2 more in the housing track if you're specifically here today for housing issues. There's workshops on housing and the eviction moratorium ending, and then later in the afternoon on mental health and service and emotional support animals. And so those are our housing conferences, but there are also many other exciting workshops that I'm personally struggling to pick from. So I hope you all join us, and thank you again. Have a great day.
Thank you.